but the most powerful piece on board because it can move both like the rook and bishop, which means it can move any number of squares vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. From this position, the queen can go to any of the squares highlighted in red. The queen can capture the first enemy piece it moves into. Let's talk about the knights now. The knight moves in the shape of an L, moving two squares in one direction except diagonal and then one square just like that. The knight from this position can move to any of the squares highlighted in red. The knight is the only piece that can jump over other pieces, meaning if there were any pieces here right next to the knight, he can simply jump over those pieces and move. If there is any opponent piece on these highlighted squares, he can capture them. Now let's talk about the pawns. The pawn is actually the most complicated piece because it has many unique qualities. A pawn is the only piece that moves in one direction and captures in a completely different direction. Pawns move one step forward towards the opponent side of the board. But if it is their first move, then they can move either one square forward like this or two squares forward like this. After its first move, the pawn can only move one square forward. So let's just say this pawn moves two squares and this pawn moves one. Each of these highlighted pawns now could only move one square forward. Now, if white moves his pawn two squares forward like this, and black also goes two squares, you might be thinking that this white pawn can now capture this black pawn. But he cannot. Like I told you earlier, pawns move one way and capture in a different way. Remember, pawns can only capture pieces diagonally in front of them, and they cannot capture pieces directly in front of them. In fact, this pawn simply cannot move or capture. He is stuck and has no legal moves. However, this pawn does. This pawn can move forward like this, or he can capture one square diagonally like this. Now you know that pawns only move forward and they never move backwards. But what's going to happen if this pawn gets all the way down to this back rank or row? Or if any of these black pawns get down to this back rank? Well, what happens is something called pawn promotion. And what that means is that the pawn simply turns into a queen, rook, bishop, or a knight. You can promote it to any of these four pieces. It's completely your choice. Now let's talk about the most important piece, and that is our king. The objective of chess is to checkmate the king. The king is priceless because if you lose the king, you simply lose the game. The king moves one square at a time in any direction. From this position, he can go to any of these squares highlighted in red. Whenever